The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Katherine Blackwell clutched her infant son against her chest, her ragged breath forming small clouds in the cool spring air of 1875. Behind her lay the small mining town of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and everything she had ever known now nothing but painful memories. She was desperate to escape. Katherine's trembling legs carried her along the dusty road, each step taking her further from the place she once called home. Just 6 days ago, her life had been different. Married to the town banker, respected by the community, living in one of the finest houses in Silver Creek. Now she was a fugitive, fleeing with nothing but the clothes on her back, a thin shawl, and her 3-month-old son Thomas. She had walked nearly 10 miles since leaving town before dawn, careful to stay off the main trails. Her feet were blistered and raw inside her impractical leather shoes, a painful reminder of how unprepared she was for this desperate journey. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and Katherine knew she needed to find shelter soon or risk her baby falling ill in the night air. "Hush now, Tommy," she whispered as he began to fuss. "We'll find somewhere safe soon." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and sage across the open land. Katherine spotted a cluster of trees near a small creek about a quarter mile off the trail. With renewed determination, she headed toward it, hoping to find some protection from the elements. As she approached the trees, Katherine nearly collapsed with relief when she saw what appeared to be an abandoned hunter's lean-to. It wasn't much, just a crude shelter of pine branches and what remained of a canvas tarp, but it would provide some protection for the night. Katherine settled in the small shelter, arranging her shawl as a makeshift bed for Thomas. The baby had been remarkably quiet throughout their journey, almost as if he understood the gravity of their situation. She pulled him close, trying to share her body heat as the night grew colder. "We'll be all right, Tommy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his downy head. "I promise we'll be all right." But as she sat there, hunger gnawing at her stomach and fear clawing at her mind, Katherine wasn't sure how she would keep that promise. She had left town with only a few pieces of bread and a small canteen of water, most of which was now gone. She had no idea where they would go or how they would survive. All she knew was that returning to Silver Creek was impossible. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by Thomas's cries of hunger and the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. By dawn, Katherine was exhausted, her eyes burning with fatigue and dried tears. Still, she forced herself to her feet. They couldn't stay here. They had to keep moving. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Katherine followed the creek, reasoning that it would eventually lead to a settlement or farm where she might find work. Thomas had grown increasingly fussy, his little face red with frustration as his mother's milk diminished from her own hunger and stress. By midday, Katherine's vision began to blur from exhaustion and hunger. The land around her seemed to tilt and sway. She stopped to rest under a cottonwood tree, fumbling to uncork her canteen. Only a few precious sips remained. She wet her cracked lips before moistening Thomas's mouth with a drop of water on her finger. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," she murmured, though she had no idea what waited for them ahead. It was then that she heard it, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats. Katherine's heart leapt to her throat. Had they followed her from Silver Creek? Had Henry somehow tracked her down? With trembling hands, she gathered Thomas and scrambled to hide behind the broad trunk of the cottonwood. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Katherine held her breath as a lone rider came into view. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who belonged on horseback, guiding his chestnut gelding alongside the creek. Katherine pressed herself harder against the tree, praying that Thomas wouldn't cry and reveal their location. But as if sensing her thoughts, the baby let out a piercing wail. Katherine froze, her blood turning to ice as the rider immediately reined in his horse, his head turning in their direction. "Hello," the man called out, his voice deep and wary. "Someone there." Katherine remained silent, clutching Thomas to her chest and desperately trying to quiet him. The rider dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch before approaching the tree with cautious steps. "I mean no harm," he said. "Sounds like you've got a little one there who needs help." When he rounded the tree, Katherine gasped, instinctively backing away. The man stopped, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Now that she could see him clearly, she realized he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-weathered skin and kind blue eyes. "Name's Preston Whitaker," he said, keeping his distance. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles west of here." Katherine hesitated, assessing the stranger. He didn't look like one of Henry's men, and there was something in his eyes that made her want to trust him. Still, she'd learned the hard way how deceiving appearances could be. "I'm just passing through," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "We don't need any help." Preston's eyes moved from her face to the fussing infant, then took in her torn dress, dirty face, and swollen feet. One eyebrow raised slightly, but he didn't comment on the obvious lie. "Well, madam, no offense, but you look like you could use a meal and a safe place to rest," he said. "And that little one sounds mighty hungry." As if to confirm this assessment, Thomas let out another cry, his tiny fists waving in frustration. "I've got fresh milk back at my place," Preston continued. "My milk cow just calved last month. Baby might not take to it right away, but it's better than nothing." Katherine wavered. Everything she knew told her not to trust this stranger, but Thomas needed food and she was at the end of her strength. If she continued on like this, they might not survive another day. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, hating how weak she sounded. Preston's expression softened. "You don't, madam, but I give you my word as a God-fearing man that I intend no harm to you or your child." He paused, then added quietly, "Whatever trouble you're running from, it won't follow you to my door." Those words, the acknowledgement that she was running, coupled with the promise of safety, broke something inside Katherine. Tears welled in her eyes as exhaustion and relief washed over her. "My name is Katherine," she said finally. "Katherine Blackwell, and this is Thomas." Preston nodded, as if accepting a solemn introduction. "Pleased to meet you both, Mrs. Blackwell." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then flushed. It wasn't true she was Mrs. Henry Blackwell, at least legally, but she couldn't bear to claim that name anymore. If Preston noticed her discomfort, he didn't show it. "My ranch isn't much to look at, but you're welcome to stay until you get your bearings. I've got a spare room that's clean, at least." Katherine knew she should refuse. She should thank him politely and continue on her way. But Thomas was crying in earnest now, and her legs threatened to give out beneath her. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll stay just for tonight." Preston nodded, stepping back to give her space. "My horse can carry you both. He's gentle as they come." The ride to Preston Whitaker's ranch took less than an hour, though to Katherine it felt much longer. She sat sideways on the saddle in front of Preston, Thomas cradled against her chest, acutely aware of the stranger's arms around her as he held the reins. He smelled of leather, pine, and horses' clean scents that reminded her of the open countryside she'd loved as a girl. Preston's ranch came into view just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It was small but well kept. A modest one-story cabin with a covered porch, a barn, a corral with several horses, and a few outbuildings. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was inside. Katherine tensed. You didn't mention others. Just my ranch hand, Miguel, Preston explained. He's been with me since I started this place 3 years ago. Good man, trustworthy. As they approached, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He glanced up, surprise evident on his weathered face when he spotted Katherine and the baby. Miguel, Preston called as he reined in his horse. We've got guests. This is Miss Blackwell and her son, Thomas. Miguel nodded respectfully but said nothing, his dark eyes curious but not unfriendly. Would you mind bringing in some of Bessie's milk? Preston asked as he dismounted, then reached up to help Katherine down. She, of course. Miguel disappeared into one of the outbuildings. Preston led Katherine to the cabin, opening the door for her. Inside, the main room was simply furnished but surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area and table to one side and a sitting area with two worn but comfortable-looking chairs to the other. Two closed doors presumably led to bedrooms. It's not fancy, Preston said, sounding almost apologetic, but it's warm and dry. It's perfect, Katherine replied honestly. After the past 2 days, the simple cabin seemed like a palace. Preston showed her to the spare bedroom, small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a washstand in the corner. A window looked out over the corral, letting in the last rays of the setting sun. Rest a bit, he suggested. I'll heat some stew for supper. When he left, Katherine sank onto the bed, the exhaustion of her journey finally catching up with her. Thomas had quieted, his eyes drooping with his own fatigue. She laid him on the bed, creating a barrier of pillows to prevent him from rolling, then quickly washed her face and hands in the basin. Miguel arrived with a small jug of milk, which Preston warmed slightly before bringing it to Katherine along with a clean rag that could serve as a makeshift bottle for Thomas. The baby resisted at first, unused to anything but his mother's milk, but hunger eventually won out, and he sucked greedily at the cow's milk-soaked cloth. With Thomas fed and sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Katherine joined Preston at the rough-hewn table where he had laid out a simple meal of venison stew, cornbread, and coffee. Miguel had retired to his small cabin near the barn after a polite nod to Katherine. You should eat, Preston said when she hesitated. You look ready to fall over. Katherine couldn't argue with that assessment. She took a tentative bite of the stew, then began to eat with desperate hunger, only slowing when Preston gently suggested she might make herself sick if she ate too quickly. As she ate, she found herself studying her host. Preston Whitaker wasn't classically handsome like Henry had been, but there was something appealing about his strong features and clear blue eyes. His hands were calloused from work, his skin tanned from long days in the sun, and a small scar ran along his jawline. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, worn denim pants, and scuffed leather boots, but they were clean and well kept. How long have you had this ranch? She asked, breaking the silence. Going on 3 years now, Preston replied. It was nothing but an abandoned hunting cabin and overgrown pasture when I found it. Took a lot of work to get it livable. It's very nice, she said sincerely. Preston smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. It suits me. Not everyone would agree, though. Most folks in these parts think a man my age should be settled with a family by now. How old are you? Katherine asked before she could stop herself. 26, he answered. Old enough to know better, young enough to still make plenty of mistakes. Katherine found herself smiling for the first time in days. I'm 22, she volunteered, though sometimes I feel much older. Preston didn't pry, didn't ask about Thomas's father or why she was traveling alone with an infant through dangerous country. Instead, he told her about his ranch, how he'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, worked on cattle drives for several years, then saved enough to buy this land. "It's not much compared to the big spreads," he explained, "but it's mine. I run about 30 head of cattle, keep a few horses, grow enough to feed myself and Miguel." It was a simple life, but the pride in his voice when he spoke of his accomplishments was unmistakable. Katherine found herself envying his contentment, his certainty in his place in the world. When they finished eating, Preston insisted she return to bed while he cleaned up. "You and the little one need rest more than I need help with dishes," he said firmly. Too exhausted to argue, Katherine retreated to the small bedroom. Through the thin walls, she could hear Preston moving about in the main room, the soft clinking of dishes and the creak of floorboards oddly comforting. For the first time since fleeing Silver Creek, Katherine allowed herself to truly relax. They were safe, at least for tonight. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new challenges, but for now she could close her eyes without fear. She fell asleep to the sound of Preston humming softly in the next room, a melody she didn't recognize, but found soothing nonetheless. Katherine woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the unfamiliar sound of Thomas cooing contentedly. For a moment, she was disoriented, panic rising in her throat until she remembered where they were: Preston Whitaker's ranch, safe for the time being. She sat up quickly, alarmed to find Thomas not beside her where she'd left him. Heart racing, she hurried from the bedroom to find Preston sitting in one of the chairs by the fireplace, her son cradled carefully in his strong arms. "Good morning," Preston said quietly, looking up with an apologetic smile. "Hope you don't mind. He was fussing and I didn't want him to wake you. Figured you needed the rest." Katherine stared, momentarily speechless. The sight of her baby, so tiny and vulnerable, held securely in this near stranger's arms, stirred something unexpected within her. Preston looked perfectly at ease, his large hands gentle as they supported Thomas's head and bottom. "I have 5 younger siblings," Preston explained, correctly interpreting her surprise. "Helped my ma with all of them. Babies and I understand each other pretty well." As if to confirm this statement, Thomas gurgled and waved a tiny fist, his expression peaceful. "I." "Thank you," Katherine said, reaching for her son. "He's not usually so calm with strangers." Preston carefully transferred Thomas to her arms. "He's a fine boy, strong too, already trying to hold his head up." Pride swelled in Katherine's chest as she looked down at her son's face. "Yes, he is." "I've got breakfast warming on the stove," Preston said, rising from the chair. "Nothing fancy, just bacon, eggs, and biscuits. Miguel brought some fresh milk for the little one, too." "You've been too kind already," Katherine protested weakly, but her stomach growled loudly, betraying her hunger. Preston's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Sounds like your stomach disagrees, Miss Blackwell." Over breakfast, Katherine found herself relaxing in Preston's company. There was something steady about him, a quiet confidence that put her at ease. He didn't press her for details about her past or her circumstances, instead focusing on practical matters. "Weather's turning nice," he commented. "Spring's finally taking hold. Good time for new beginnings." Katherine nodded, understanding the gentle invitation in his words. "Mr. Whitaker, Preston, please." "Preston," she amended. "I can't impose on your hospitality much longer. We should move on tomorrow." He set down his coffee cup, his expression carefully neutral. "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air between them. Katherine had no answer. She had fled Silver Creek with no destination in mind, only the desperate need to get away. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Perhaps Genoa, Nevada. I've heard there's work there for women who are willing." Preston frowned slightly. "That's a hard journey for a woman alone with a baby." nearly 200 miles through mountain country. I don't have many options, Katherine said, her voice tighter than she intended. Preston was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I have a proposition, Miss Blackwell. Katherine tensed, immediately wary. She'd heard those words before, from men whose propositions were far from honorable. Seeing her reaction, Preston quickly added, Nothing improper, I assure you. It's just I need help around here. The place is growing and there's more work than Miguel and I can manage alone. What kind of help? Katherine asked cautiously. Cooking for one, Preston said with a self-deprecating smile. I'm not much good at it, as you might have noticed. The garden needs tending. The house could use a woman's touch. He paused. And I've got an old mare about to foal who could use watching over. Katherine considered his words. What he was suggesting sounded like the position of a housekeeper, not the arrangement she had feared. Still, she hesitated. I couldn't accept charity, Mr. Whitaker Preston. I would need to earn my keep. You would, he assured her. I'd pay you fair wages, same as I pay Miguel. You and Thomas would have this room, meals included. It would be a proper employment arrangement. The offer was tempting more than tempting. A safe place for Thomas, honest work, time to plan their future. But Katherine knew all too well how quickly security could be snatched away. What if someone comes looking for me? She asked quietly. Preston's expression hardened slightly. Is someone likely to? Katherine hesitated, then nodded once, not meeting his eyes. Well, Preston said after a moment, this is my land. Anyone who comes here uninvited will answer to me. The simple statement carried the weight of a solemn promise. Katherine looked up, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only earnest blue eyes looking back at her with patient kindness. All right, she said finally. We'll stay, at least until I've saved enough to move on safely. Preston smiled, the tension leaving his shoulders. Good, that's good. He rose from the table. I need to check on that mare. Make yourself at home, Katherine. This is your place now, too. As he left, Katherine remained at the table, wondering if she had made the right decision or simply traded one uncertain future for another. The first week at Preston's ranch passed in a blur of adjustment for Katherine. Preston gave her time to settle in, showing her around the property and introducing her to the rhythms of ranch life. The small cabin became her domain, and she took satisfaction in bringing order to the bachelor household. She swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in months, washed windows clouded with dust, and organized the kitchen that had clearly been arranged by men who cooked only out of necessity. Preston and Miguel accepted her changes without complaint, both men seeming grateful for the improvements. The first night she served a properly seasoned stew with fresh baked bread. Preston declared it the best meal he'd had since leaving his mother's house in Pennsylvania. If you cook like this every night, I might never let you and Thomas leave, he joked, helping himself to a second serving. Katherine had smiled at the compliment, but the casual words had stirred an unexpected pang in her chest. She was beginning to like it here perhaps too much. This arrangement was temporary, she reminded herself. They would move on eventually. Thomas thrived in the clean mountain air, growing stronger each day. Katherine fashioned a sling from an old blanket so she could carry him while working, and he seemed content to watch the world from this perch, his bright eyes following the movement of birds and animals with fascination. Preston proved to be as good with Thomas as he had first appeared. In the evenings, he would often offer to hold the baby while Katherine prepared dinner or took a few moments for herself. Sometimes she would find them on the porch, Preston pointing out stars or describing the distant mountains in a low, gentle voice, as if Thomas could understand every word. It was during the second week that Katherine truly began to see the man behind Preston's quiet exterior. He worked from dawn until dusk, tending the cattle, mending fences, breaking new horses with a patient hand. Unlike Henry, who had delegated all physical labor to others, Preston wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He approached each task with the same steady determination, whether it was mucking stalls or negotiating with the cattle buyers who occasionally visited the ranch. One afternoon, Katherine was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the distinctive sound of Preston's horse approaching at a gallop unusual, as he typically rode at a more measured pace. She turned, shading her eyes against the sun, to see him dismounting quickly at the corral. "Katherine," he called, striding toward her with purpose. "Is Thomas inside?" "Yes, sleeping," she replied, alarm rising at his serious expression. "What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Preston said, though his tense posture suggested otherwise. "But there's a group of riders heading this way from the east. Miguel spotted them from the north pasture." "Riders?" Katherine's mouth went dry. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Preston's eyes met hers. "Could be just passing through, could be something else." Katherine's hands began to tremble. "Henry," she whispered. "My husband." Preston's expression darkened. "Your husband, the one you're running from," she nodded, unable to speak past the fear closing her throat. "Get inside," Preston said quietly. "Lock the door, don't come out until I call for you." Katherine gathered the damp clothes quickly, her mind racing. She hurried into the cabin, checking on Thomas, who slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle, a drawer from Preston's dresser that he had lined with soft blankets. After ensuring the baby was safe, she peered through the window to see Preston retrieving his rifle from the barn. A few minutes later, the riders came into view, 5 men on horseback, led by a figure Katherine recognized instantly. Even at a distance, Henry Blackwell's rigid posture and immaculate clothing marked him as different from the other riders. Katherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Preston walk calmly to meet them, rifle held casually but visibly at his side. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she could see Henry gesturing emphatically while Preston stood his ground, responding with what appeared to be deliberate calm. After several tense minutes, Preston pointed back toward the road, his meaning clear. "Leave." One of Henry's men moved his horse forward aggressively, but Preston raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but a clear warning. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity before Henry finally turned his horse, clearly furious. As the group rode away, Henry turned back once, his face visible to Katherine for the first time. The hatred in his expression sent a chill through her body. When Preston returned to the cabin, his face was grim but composed. Katherine met him at the door, her eyes questioning. "They're gone," he confirmed. "For now." "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Preston set his rifle by the door before answering. "That you're his wife. That you stole his son and ran off. That I'd do well to turn you over before I found myself on the wrong side of the law." Katherine closed her eyes briefly, shame and anger washing over her. "And what did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen his wife," Preston said simply. "That there's a young widow named Katherine staying here with her baby, working as my housekeeper. That he and his men were trespassing on private property." Tears pricked at Katherine's eyes. "He'll be back." "Probably," Preston agreed. "But not today, and not alone next time." He studied her face carefully. "Katherine, I won't ask you to tell me everything, but I need to know what kind of man we're dealing with, how far he'll go." Katherine sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Henry will go as far as he needs to," she said quietly. "He's used to getting what he wants." She took a deep breath and continued, the words spilling out after being contained for so long. "I married Henry when I was 19. He seemed so charming, so different from the boys I'd grown up with. He was the banker's son, educated back east. When he asked for my hand, my parents were thrilled. They thought I was making a good match. Preston sat across from her, listening intently as she spoke. The first year wasn't bad. Henry was busy at the bank, learning the business from his father. But after the old man died and Henry took over, things changed. He became. She hesitated, searching for the right word, controlling, cruel when he didn't get his way. "Did he hurt you?" Preston asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Katherine could see the tension in his jaw. "Not at first, not physically. But he monitored everything: who I spoke to, what I wore, where I went. I wasn't allowed to visit friends without his permission. He checked the household accounts to the penny." She swallowed hard. "When I became pregnant with Thomas, I thought things might improve. Henry wanted a son, an heir, but they got worse." Preston waited silently as she gathered her courage to continue. "He began to drink more heavily, and when he drank, his temper—" Katherine trailed off, unconsciously touching her cheek where a fading bruise was still visible beneath the tan she'd developed working outdoors. "After Thomas was born, Henry was disappointed. Said the boy was too small, too weak. Called him," her voice broke. "Called him a disappointment, just like his mother." Preston's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, letting her finish. "2 weeks ago, Henry came home drunk, raging about something that had happened at the bank. I tried to quiet him so he wouldn't wake Thomas, but that only made him angrier. He hit me, harder than before. I fell against the fireplace and—" She pushed up her sleeve to reveal a partially healed burn on her forearm. "When I tried to get away, he said if I ever tried to leave him, he would take Thomas away. That no court would give a child to a mother who couldn't care for him properly." "So you ran," Preston said softly. Katherine nodded. "That night after he passed out. I took Thomas, a few supplies, and left. I knew he would follow, but I thought if I could get far enough away, find work somewhere, maybe I could start over." She looked up at Preston, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I couldn't let my son grow up with that man. I couldn't." Preston reached across the table, hesitating before gently covering her hand with his. "You did the right thing, Katherine. No woman should endure what you described. No child should see his mother treated that way." The simple validation broke something inside her. Katherine began to cry, quiet tears at first, then deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. Preston moved to kneel beside her chair, awkwardly patting her shoulder, offering silent support until the storm of emotion passed. "I'm sorry," she said finally, wiping her face with trembling hands. "You've been nothing but kind, and now I've brought trouble to your doorstep." "Don't apologize," Preston said firmly. "Henry Blackwell is the one who should be apologizing, not you." He stood, his expression resolute. "This changes nothing about our arrangement except that we'll need to be more vigilant. Miguel and I will take turns keeping watch for a while." "But what if they come back with the law?" Katherine asked. "Henry has influence. People respect him." "Let me worry about that," Preston replied. "For now, you and Thomas are safe here. That's what matters." As he spoke, Thomas began to fuss in his cradle, his nap disturbed by the tension in the room. Katherine rose to attend to him, lifting the baby into her arms with practiced ease. As she soothed her son, she found Preston watching them, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Preston nodded once, then turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Katherine," he said without looking back, "I meant what I told your husband. As far as I'm concerned, you're a widow making a new start. The man who hurt you has no claim on you or your son." With those words, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Katherine stood in the center of the cabin, cradling Thomas and wondering how, after everything she had endured, She had found this unexpected sanctuary and this equally unexpected protector. The days following Henry's visit were tense but uneventful. Preston and Miguel took turns patrolling the property, and Katherine rarely ventured far from the cabin. Despite the threat hanging over them, life at the ranch continued its steady rhythm. The cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and the garden wouldn't wait for human troubles to resolve themselves. Katherine threw herself into her work with renewed purpose, grateful for the distraction. She expanded the vegetable garden, using seeds Preston had purchased the previous fall but never planted. She took over the cooking entirely, preparing hearty meals that earned appreciative nods from both men. In the evenings, she mended clothes and even began to sew new curtains from fabric Preston brought back from a supply run to the nearest town. As spring deepened into summer, the ranch blossomed under Katherine's care. The cabin, once merely functional, began to feel like a home. She arranged wildflowers in tin cans on the table, hung the new curtains at the windows, and kept everything spotlessly clean. Preston noticed these changes with quiet approval, often commenting that the place hadn't looked so good since he'd built it. For his part, Preston seemed to be making changes of his own. He began spending more time at the cabin in the evenings, whittling by the fire while Katherine sewed or sang softly to Thomas. Sometimes he would read aloud from one of the few books. He owned mostly practical manuals on ranching and horsekeeping, but also a volume of Thoreau and a well-worn Bible. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Preston broke their comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The cabin's getting cramped with the three of us." Katherine's stomach tightened with anxiety. Was he asking her to leave after all? "The ranch is doing well this year," Preston continued, apparently oblivious to her concern. "I've been meaning to expand the house for some time now. Add a proper bedroom for myself, maybe a small room for Thomas as he grows." Katherine stared at him, processing his words. "You want to build onto the cabin?" Preston nodded, still gazing at the sunset. "This place was never meant to be permanent, just somewhere to start. But now—" He glanced at her. "Now it seems worth investing in improvements." "Because of us?" Katherine asked hesitantly. Preston shifted in his chair, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. "Partly, yes. You and Thomas need proper space, but also because this is my home. It should be more than just a roof and four walls." Katherine smiled, touched by his consideration. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Preston." He returned her smile, relief evident in his expression. "Good. I've already worked out most of the details. Miguel's cousin is a skilled carpenter. He helped build the barn. I thought we could start next week, while the weather's good." True to his word, Preston began the expansion project the following Monday. Miguel's cousin, Raphael, arrived with his teenage son, both skilled with tools and eager for the work. Preston had ordered lumber from the sawmill in town, and the men set to work laying the foundation for the addition. Katherine watched with fascination as the structure took shape. Preston had clearly put significant thought into the design. The addition would nearly double the size of the cabin, adding 2 proper bedrooms and expanding the main living area. He consulted her on details like the placement of windows and the size of the bedrooms, seeming genuinely interested in her opinions. "This one will be Thomas's room," he explained one evening, showing her the smaller of the new bedrooms. "And this larger one can be yours." "I'll take the current bedroom." "But that's your room," Katherine protested. "You shouldn't have to move." Preston shrugged. "The new one has better light. Besides, it'll give you and Thomas more privacy." Katherine was struck once again by his thoughtfulness. Henry had never once considered her comfort or preferences. Yet here was Preston, literally building rooms with her needs in mind. As the summer progressed, the addition neared completion. Preston worked alongside Raphael and his son whenever he could spare time from ranch duties. His shirt darkened with sweat as he sawed lumber and hammered nails. Katherine often brought them water or lemonade. Thomas balanced on her hip as she navigated the construction area. One particularly hot afternoon in August, she approached with a pitcher of cold water to find Preston working alone, shirtless in the heat, his tanned skin glistening with exertion as he fitted a window frame. Katherine stopped short, momentarily transfixed by the sight of his muscled back and shoulders. A strange, fluttering sensation took root in her stomach, and she nearly dropped the pitcher when Preston turned and noticed her. "Water," she said quickly, holding up the pitcher. "I thought you might be thirsty." If Preston noticed her flustered state, he didn't comment. He wiped his hands on his pants before accepting the cup she offered, drinking deeply. "Thank you," he said, returning the cup. "Another week or so and we should be finished." Katherine nodded, trying not to stare at his bare chest. "It looks wonderful already. You've done amazing work." Preston smiled, genuine pleasure lighting his face at the compliment. "Couldn't have done it without Raphael and Mateo, or you for that matter, keeping us fed and watered through all this." "It's the least I could do," Katherine said. "You're building this for us after all." "For all of us," Preston corrected gently. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Katherine felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. She looked away first, suddenly aware of Thomas squirming in her arms. "I should get him inside for his nap," she said quickly. "Don't work too hard in this heat." Preston nodded, already turning back to the window frame. "I won't." That night, lying in bed with Thomas sleeping beside her, Katherine found herself unable to sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to Preston, his kindness, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And if she was honest with herself, the memory of his bare chest and strong arms as he worked on their home. Their home. The phrase echoed in her mind, both comforting and troubling. When had she begun to think of this place as home? When had Preston Whitaker become more than just her employer? Katherine turned restlessly, trying to silence these dangerous thoughts. She had escaped one bad marriage. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for another man, especially one who had only ever shown her kindness and respect, never anything more. Still, as she finally drifted towards sleep, Katherine couldn't help wondering if Preston ever lay awake thinking about her the way she was thinking about him. The new addition was completed in early September, just as the first hints of autumn began to color the aspen trees surrounding the ranch. The day they moved the furniture into the new rooms felt like a celebration. Preston insisted on carrying Katherine's few belongings into her new bedroom himself, while she followed with Thomas and the baby's small cradle, a gift Preston had purchased on his last trip to town. "What do you think?" Preston asked as Katherine surveyed her new room. It was larger than the one she had been using, with 2 windows providing ample light and a view of both the mountains to the west and the corral to the south. Preston had even built a small wardrobe and a chest of drawers, though Katherine had few clothes to fill them. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "I've never had such a lovely room." Preston looked pleased. "There's one more thing," he said, gesturing for her to follow him to Thomas's room. Katherine gasped when she entered the smaller bedroom. In the center stood a beautifully crafted wooden crib, complete with spindles and a rocking base. It was clearly handmade, the wood sanded smooth and polished to a warm glow. "Preston," she breathed, running her hand over the curved headboard. "Did you make this?" He nodded, looking both proud and slightly embarrassed. Been working on it in the evenings in the barn, wanted it to be a surprise. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. No one had ever created something so beautiful for her son. "It's the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Preston shifted awkwardly, unused to such gratitude. "Every boy needs a proper bed," he said gruffly. "The drawer was just temporary." Katherine placed Thomas in the crib, where he immediately began exploring the smooth rails with his tiny hands, cooing happily. The sight of her son in this lovingly crafted crib in a room built specifically for him overwhelmed her with emotion. Without thinking, she turned and threw her arms around Preston in a spontaneous hug. He stiffened momentarily in surprise before his arms came around her, returning the embrace with gentle pressure. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt, "for everything." Preston's arms tightened slightly. "You're welcome, Katherine," he said, his voice deeper than usual. When she pulled back, their faces were inches apart. Katherine could see the flecks of darker blue in Preston's eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he might kiss her, and worse, she realized she wanted him to. The moment was broken by Thomas's impatient cry. Katherine stepped back quickly, flustered and confused by her own reaction. "He's hungry," she said unnecessarily, moving to lift her son from the crib. Preston nodded, backing toward the door. "I'll let you settle in," he said. "Got some chores to finish before dinner." After he left, Katherine sat in the small rocking chair by the window, nursing Thomas and trying to make sense of her feelings. She had come to Preston's ranch seeking safety and temporary shelter. She had not expected to find a man who would build her son a crib with his own hands, who would expand his home to make room for them, who would defend them against Henry without hesitation. She had not expected to find herself falling in love. The realization should have frightened her. After Henry, Katherine had sworn she would never give another man power over her heart or her life. Yet Preston was nothing like Henry. Where Henry had been controlling, Preston respected her independence. Where Henry had seen Thomas as a disappointment, Preston treated the baby with genuine affection and care. Where Henry had used fear to control her, Preston offered safety with no strings attached. Still, Katherine reminded herself firmly, Preston had never expressed any romantic interest in her. He was a kind man who had offered help to a woman and child in need. Reading more into his actions would only lead to disappointment or worse, might jeopardize the safe haven they had found. With that sobering thought, Katherine pushed her feelings aside and focused on the practical matters at hand, arranging Thomas's new room, preparing dinner, and settling into their expanded home. There would be time enough to sort through her confusing emotions later. As September gave way to October, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The cattle were fat from summer grazing, the garden yielded its final harvest, and the expanded cabin proved to be warmer and more comfortable than the original structure had been. Preston seemed more relaxed now that the building was complete, spending more evenings at home rather than working late in the barn or fields. One such evening, as the first real cold snap of autumn descended on the valley, Katherine sat by the fire mending one of Preston's shirts while he whittled what appeared to be a small wooden horse. Thomas was already asleep in his new crib, the ranch quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the soft scrape of Preston's knife against the wood. "Winter comes early up here," Preston commented, breaking their comfortable silence. "First snow usually hits before the end of October." Katherine glanced up from her sewing. "Will the cattle be all right?" Preston nodded. "They're hardy stock. We'll move them to the lower pasture next week, where there's more shelter, but we should think about laying in more supplies before the snow makes the trip to town difficult. I've been preserving as much from the garden as possible, Katherine said. The root cellar is nearly full, and I've dried herbs and made jam from the wild berries. Preston smiled approvingly. You're a natural at ranch life for a town girl. My grandmother taught me about preserving food, Katherine explained. She grew up on a farm in Ohio before moving west, said a woman should always know how to feed her family, no matter the circumstances. Wise woman, Preston said. He hesitated, then added, Speaking of town, I need to make a trip day after tomorrow. There are some legal matters I've been putting off. Katherine tensed slightly. Legal matters. Preston set down his whittling, his expression serious. I've been thinking about the future, Katherine. About you and Thomas. Her heart began to pound. What about us, your husband? Preston said carefully. He hasn't returned, but that doesn't mean he's given up. Men like that rarely do. Katherine's hands stilled on her mending. I know. I spoke with Judge Parker last time I was in town, Preston continued. Discreetly, of course. Asked about a woman's rights in a situation like yours. And what did he say? Katherine asked, barely breathing. Preston sighed. The law generally favors husbands in these matters. But there are exceptions, especially in cases where there's evidence of cruelty. He met her eyes directly. If you had witnesses to what Henry did, or if a doctor had documented your injuries, you might have grounds for divorce. The hope that had briefly flared in Katherine's chest dimmed. I have neither of those things, she said quietly. I hid the bruises, was too ashamed to tell anyone. Preston nodded as if he had expected this answer. There's another way, he said after a moment. Not ideal, perhaps, but effective. What is it? We could file homestead papers, Preston explained. For this land. Currently it's registered only in my name, but under the Homestead Act, a married couple can claim twice the acreage. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. If we were married, Katherine, your legal status would change. You would no longer be Henry Blackwell's runaway wife, you would be Preston Whitaker's legal spouse. It would make it much harder for Henry to assert any claim over you or Thomas. Katherine stared at him, struggling to process his words. You're proposing marriage to me. Preston set aside his whittling knife entirely, looking uncomfortable but determined. I'm proposing a solution to a problem, a legal arrangement that would protect you and Thomas. A marriage of convenience, Katherine said, her voice flat despite the sudden turmoil of her emotions. Yes, Preston agreed, then hesitated. Although I hope it would be more than just convenient, I've come to care for you and Thomas a great deal, Katherine. The careful wording didn't escape her notice. Care, not love. A practical arrangement, not a romantic one. Katherine should have been relieved. This was exactly the kind of sensible approach she had promised herself. She would take if she ever considered marriage again. Yet she couldn't help the disappointment that swept through her. You don't have to answer now, Preston added quickly, misreading her silence. It's a big decision. Take some time to think about it. Katherine nodded mechanically, her mind racing. Thank you for considering our welfare, she said formally, rising from her chair. I should check on Thomas. She retreated to her room, closing the door quietly behind her. Thomas slept peacefully in his crib, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Katherine sat on the edge of her bed, trying to sort through her confused feelings. Preston was offering her protection and security, exactly what she needed. It was a generous, practical solution to her precarious situation. So why did it feel so hollow? Because you want him to love you, a small voice whispered in her mind. Not just care for you or feel responsible for you. Katherine pressed her hands to her eyes, willing away the threatening tears. She was being foolish. After everything she had been through with Henry, she should be grateful for a man who respected her. who was kind to her son, who offered marriage as protection rather than possession. Love, with all its messy emotions and potential for heartbreak, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tomorrow, she decided, she would accept Preston's proposal. She would be grateful for his protection and friendship. She would make a good home for him, care for his ranch, and raise Thomas in safety. It would be enough. It had to be enough. When Katherine emerged from her room the next morning, Preston was already gone, having left at dawn to check on the cattle in the high pasture. She busied herself with household chores, trying to organize her thoughts before the conversation she knew they must have when he returned. By mid-afternoon, the western sky had darkened with ominous clouds, the temperature dropping rapidly as a cold front moved in. Katherine stood on the porch, watching anxiously as the storm approached. Preston had been gone much longer than usual, and she couldn't help worrying. Just as the first fat snowflakes began to fall, she spotted a rider approaching from the north pasture. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by concern when she realized the horse was moving much too slowly, and the rider seemed to be slumped forward in the saddle. "Preston," Katherine called, hurrying down the porch steps despite the rapidly falling snow. As the horse drew closer, her fear was confirmed. Preston was barely staying in the saddle, one hand pressed to his side, his face pale and drawn with pain. "Katherine," he managed as she reached him, "had a little trouble with that new stallion." Before she could respond, Preston's eyes rolled back and he slid sideways from the saddle. Katherine cried out, managing to break his fall slightly but not prevent it entirely. He landed heavily on the ground, a groan escaping his lips. "Preston, can you hear me?" Katherine knelt beside him, pushing back his coat to find his shirt soaked with blood. "Oh God!" With strength born of desperation, Katherine somehow managed to help Preston to his feet and half carry, half drag him into the house. By the time she got him to his bedroom, her dress was stained with his blood, and Preston was barely conscious. "Need to get Miguel," Preston murmured. "Miguel rode to town this morning, remember? He won't be back until tomorrow." Katherine worked quickly to remove Preston's coat and shirt, revealing a deep gash in his side where something, probably the stallion's hoof, had caught him. "What happened?" Stallion spooked, reared up. "Caught me with his hoof when I fell." Preston's words were slurred, his face alarmingly pale beneath his tan. "Not as bad as it looks." "Don't lie to me, Preston Whitaker," Katherine said sharply, pressing a clean cloth against the wound to slow the bleeding. "This is bad." The cut was deep, starting at his lower ribs and extending several inches across his side. It would need stitches, and soon, or infection would set in. Katherine had assisted the doctor in Silver Creek enough times to recognize the danger. "I need to clean and stitch this," she told Preston, trying to keep her voice calm despite her rising panic. "It's going to hurt." Preston managed a weak smile. "Do what you need to do. I trust you." Those three simple words steadied Katherine's nerves. She gathered what supplies she could find: whiskey for disinfecting, a needle and thread from her sewing basket, clean cloths, and a basin of hot water. Thomas, thankfully, was still napping, unaware of the crisis unfolding. "Drink this first," she said, holding the whiskey bottle to Preston's lips. He took several long swallows, grimacing at the burn. Katherine then poured a generous amount over the wound, causing Preston to jerk and curse under his breath. "Sorry," she murmured, cleaning the area as gently as possible. "I need to see how deep it is." The examination confirmed her fears. The gash was deep enough to require multiple stitches. Preston's breathing was rapid and shallow, his skin clammy with shock and blood loss. Katherine knew she needed to work quickly. "I'm going to start stitching now," she warned him. "Try to stay still." Preston nodded, his jaw clenched in anticipation of the pain. Katherine took a deep breath to steady her hands, then began. The next 20 minutes were among the most harrowing of Katherine's life. She worked as quickly and carefully as she could, grateful for the time she had watched Dr. Lambert suture wounds back in Silver Creek. Preston remained conscious throughout, his body rigid with pain, occasional grunts escaping despite his obvious effort to remain stoic. When she finally tied off the last stitch, Katherine sat back, exhausted and shaking. "Done," she said softly. "You did well." Preston's eyes were glazed with pain and whiskey, but he managed to focus on her face. "So did you," he murmured. "Thank you." Katherine applied a clean bandage to the wound, then helped Preston drink some water. "You need to rest now," she said, pulling the blanket over him. "Don't try to move, Katherine," Preston said, catching her hand as she turned to leave. "About yesterday, my proposal." "Hush," she interrupted gently. "We'll talk about that when you're better. Rest now." Preston's eyes closed, his grip on her hand loosening as exhaustion claimed him. Katherine checked to make sure he was breathing steadily, then quietly left the room to wash the blood from her hands and check on Thomas. The storm that had begun as Preston returned now raged in full force, snow and wind howling around the cabin. Katherine was grateful for the solid walls and the ample firewood Preston had insisted on stockpiling. She built up the fire, fed and changed Thomas, and prepared a simple broth for when Preston woke. Throughout the evening, she checked on him regularly, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead when fever began to rise, encouraging him to drink water when he stirred. By midnight, Preston was restless with fever, sometimes mumbling incoherently in his sleep. Katherine sat beside his bed, bathing his face and neck with cool water, worry gnawing at her. What if the wound became infected? What if the fever grew worse? The nearest doctor was in town, a good half-day's ride away, and with the storm, the journey would be impossible even if Miguel were here to make it. As the night deepened, Preston's fever seemed to peak. He tossed restlessly, calling out names Katherine didn't recognize, comrades from the war, perhaps, or family members back east. She continued her vigilant care, speaking soothingly to him when he grew agitated, checking the wound for signs of infection, praying silently for his recovery. It was during one of these fevered episodes that Preston, half delirious, caught her hand and looked at her with surprising clarity. "Katherine," he said, his voice hoarse. "Beautiful Katherine." "I'm here," she assured him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You're going to be all right." "Need to tell you," Preston insisted, his grip on her hand surprisingly strong. "Not just convenience, not just protection." "SHH," Katherine soothed. "Save your strength, we can talk later," but Preston shook his head stubbornly. "Might not be a later, need you to know. Love you. Have for months." His blue eyes, bright with fever, held hers intently. Should have said it properly, not just offered a practical arrangement. Katherine's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead at double speed. "You love me," she whispered. "Love you," Preston confirmed, the words slurring slightly as his energy flagged. "Love Thomas too, want us to be real family, not just on paper." Tears filled Katherine's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Oh, Preston," she said softly, "I love you too, have for so long." A smile touched Preston's lips before his eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion claiming him once more. Katherine sat beside him, her mind reeling from his confession. He loved her, not just cared for her, not just felt responsible for her, he loved her. For the rest of that long night, Katherine kept her vigil, alternately praying and planning. If Preston recovered when he recovered, she corrected herself firmly, they would have a second chance at happiness. A real marriage, a real family, a life built on love rather than fear or mere practicality. As dawn broke, The storm began to ease, thin sunlight filtering through the curtains. Katherine, exhausted from her night-long watch, checked Preston's forehead and found it cooler. His breathing had steadied, and when she examined the wound, it showed no signs of serious infection. The crisis, it seemed, had passed. Relief washed over her, leaving her weak with gratitude. Preston would recover. They would have their chance at happiness after all. Katherine gently brushed a lock of hair from Preston's forehead, allowing herself a moment to study his face, the strong jaw now covered with stubble, the straight nose, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes. This was the face of the man she loved, the man who had offered her and Thomas not just shelter but a home, not just protection but love. "We'll be waiting when you wake up," she whispered, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead before quietly leaving to tend to Thomas, who had begun to stir in his crib. Preston's recovery was slower than either of them would have liked, but steady. The fever broke completely by the second day, and though he was weak from blood loss and in considerable pain, his natural strength and determination served him well. Katherine kept the wound clean, changed the bandages regularly, and ensured he ate nourishing food to rebuild his strength. Miguel, who had returned the day after the accident, took over the essential ranch duties, allowing Preston to focus on healing. The older man's weathered face had shown rare emotion when he first saw Preston's condition, muttering rapid Spanish that Katherine suspected contained both prayers and curses. Neither Katherine nor Preston mentioned his fevered confession of love. At first, Katherine wondered if he even remembered saying it, but occasionally she would catch him watching her with a thoughtful expression that made her suspect he recalled more than he let on. For her part, Katherine was content to wait until Preston was stronger before addressing the subject that now seemed to hover between them like a tangible presence. A week after the accident, Preston was well enough to sit on the porch, bundled against the autumn chill, watching as Katherine hung laundry on the line while Thomas played on a blanket nearby. The baby, now nearly 7 months old, had recently mastered the art of sitting up unassisted and was happily exploring a wooden rattle Preston had carved for him. "He's growing so fast," Preston commented, his eyes warm as he watched Thomas. "Soon he'll be crawling everywhere." Katherine smiled, pinning one of Preston's shirts to the line, and then walking and then running. "They don't stay babies for long." "No, they don't," Preston agreed thoughtfully. He shifted slightly in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Katherine, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral as she reached for another piece of laundry. "What is it?" "That night when I was fevered," Preston began, his voice careful, "I have some memories of things I might have said. Things that might have been a dream." Katherine's hand stilled on the damp cloth. "What kind of things?" Preston's eyes met hers, direct and unwavering. "That I love you, that I want us to be a real family, not just a practical arrangement." A blush warmed Katherine's cheeks. "That wasn't a dream," she confirmed softly. Preston nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "And did you respond?" Katherine abandoned the laundry, moving to sit in the chair beside him. "I did," she said simply. "I told you I love you too." A smile broke across Preston's face, transforming it with joy. "I was afraid I'd imagined that part," he admitted. "Or that you just said it because you thought I was dying." Katherine shook her head, reaching out to take his hand. "I meant every word, Preston. I've loved you for months, but I was afraid. After Henry, I promised myself I wouldn't be vulnerable again." "I understand that," Preston said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "After what you've been through, I wouldn't blame you for never wanting to marry again." "That's just it," Katherine said, looking into his eyes. "I do want to marry again, but only if it's you. You've shown me what love really is, Preston. Not possession or control, but support and respect and kindness." Preston brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I meant what I said about wanting to marry you, Katherine, but not for legal protection or practical considerations, though those are still valid reasons." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I want to marry you because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you and Thomas in it. Because this place didn't feel like a home until you came here." Tears of happiness filled Catherine's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Whitaker." His smile was radiant as he leaned forward, careful of his injured side, and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost tentative, but it sent warmth spreading through Catherine's entire body. When they parted, both were smiling like they'd discovered a wonderful secret. "How soon can we do it?" Preston asked, still holding her hand. Katherine laughed, the sound light and joyous. "Eager, are we?" "Very," Preston admitted without shame. "I've waited months to call you my wife. Don't want to wait much longer." "We'll need to go to town, find a preacher," Katherine said, her practical side asserting itself even as happiness bubbled within her. "And you're in no condition to travel yet." Preston grimaced in acknowledgement of this truth. 2 weeks, he decided. "I'll be well enough by then, and it will give Miguel time to prepare the ranch for our absence." 2 weeks, Katherine agreed, sealing the decision with another kiss. Thomas chose that moment to drop his rattle and protest loudly, making both adults laugh. Katherine rose to retrieve the toy, handing it back to her son with a smile. "What do you think, Thomas?" she asked playfully. "Should Mama marry Mr. Preston?" Thomas responded with a happy gurgle, waving the rattle enthusiastically. "I believe that's a yes," Preston said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. As promised, 2 weeks later, Preston was well enough to travel. The wound had healed cleanly, thanks to Catherine's careful nursing, and though he was still not at full strength, he could ride and move without significant pain. They made the journey to town, a settlement called Genoa in the Montana Territory, with Thomas securely bundled against the November chill. Miguel remained at the ranch, promising to keep everything in order during their absence. Genoa was small but growing, with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and importantly, a church with a resident preacher. Preston had sent word ahead through a passing rancher, so Reverend Johnson was expecting them when they arrived. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held in the small wooden church with only the Reverend's wife and the hotel proprietor as witnesses. Katherine wore her best dress, still plain but freshly pressed with wildflowers Preston had somehow found despite the late season tucked into her upswept hair. Thomas, dressed in a new outfit Preston had purchased secretly on his last trip to town, watched the proceedings from the arms of Mrs. Johnson, occasionally cooing or babbling as if offering his own commentary on the event. When Preston slid a simple gold band onto Catherine's finger, another surprise he had arranged and promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all his days, Katherine felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was what marriage should be, a promise between equals, founded on love and mutual respect. After the ceremony, they shared a meal at the small hotel, splurging on the best the establishment had to offer. Preston had arranged for a private room for the night, their first as husband and wife, though he admitted with some embarrassment that his still healing wound might limit their wedding night celebrations. "We have our whole lives ahead of us," Katherine assured him, touched by his consideration even in this most intimate aspect of marriage. "I'm just happy to be your wife at last." The following morning, they began the journey home to their ranch, their expanded cabin, their life together. Katherine rode with Thomas secured in front of her, occasionally glancing at Preston, still hardly believing that this good, honorable man was now her husband. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked. Catching one of these glances, Katherine smiled. "That I'm the luckiest woman in the territory." Preston chuckled. "Funny, I was just thinking I'm the luckiest man." As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Preston reined in his horse, gesturing for Katherine to do the same. From this vantage point, they could see the entire property, the cabin with its new addition, the barn, the corral where horses grazed, the pastures beyond where cattle dotted the landscape. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitaker," Preston said softly. Katherine's heart swelled with emotion. Home. After months of uncertainty and fear, she finally had a true home, not just a physical place, but a haven of love and security for herself and her son. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with feeling. Preston reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Not half as beautiful as my wife," he said with a smile. "Come on, let's go home." As they rode down toward the cabin, Katherine sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. 8 months ago, she had fled Silver Creek with nothing but her baby and desperate hope. Now she returned to this ranch not as a fugitive or a housekeeper, but as Preston Whitaker's beloved wife, Thomas's mother, and the mistress of a home built with love. The winter of 1875-1876 was harsh in the Montana Territory, with heavy snowfall and bitter cold that kept the Whitaker family largely confined to their cabin for weeks at a time. Yet for Katherine, these months were among the happiest of her life. The expanded cabin was warm and snug, with ample firewood stacked on the covered porch and the root cellar well stocked with preserved vegetables and meat. Preston had insisted on making one more trip to town before the worst of the winter weather set in, returning with supplies that included fabric for new curtains and clothes, books to read during the long winter evenings, and even a small rocking horse for Thomas's upcoming first birthday. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Preston and Miguel would rise before dawn to tend the livestock, breaking ice on the water troughs and distributing feed to the cattle in the lower pasture. Katherine would have breakfast waiting when they returned, the cabin warm and fragrant with the scent of coffee and bacon. The daylight hours were filled with necessary work, mending clothes, caring for Thomas, preserving meat when Preston managed to hunt deer or elk, and keeping the cabin in order. In the evenings, they would gather by the fire, Preston often reading aloud while Katherine sewed or knitted. Thomas thrived under the constant attention of 3 adults who adored him. By Christmas, he was crawling everywhere, pulling himself up on furniture, and attempting his first wobbly steps while holding Preston's hands. His happy babbling filled the cabin, occasional recognizable words like Mama and Pa, his name for Preston, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. The transition to married life was surprisingly easy for Katherine and Preston. Their months of living under the same roof had already established many of the patterns of shared life, and the deeper intimacy of marriage seemed a natural progression of the friendship and respect they had developed. Preston proved to be a considerate and tender husband, patient with Katherine's occasional moments of panic when memories of Henry intruded on their happiness. On the rare occasions when a nightmare would wake her, Preston would simply hold her, his steady presence chasing away the shadows of the past. "He can't hurt you anymore," Preston would murmur, stroking her hair until her breathing steadied. "You're safe now, you and Thomas both." As winter deepened, Katherine began to suspect that their family might soon be growing. The subtle changes in her body were familiar from her pregnancy with Thomas: the tenderness, the fatigue, the slight nausea in the mornings. She kept her suspicions to herself at first, wanting to be certain before sharing the news with Preston. By February, she was sure. One evening, after Thomas had been put to bed in his crib, Katherine joined Preston by the fire where he was repairing a bridle. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice soft but excited. Preston looked up, setting aside his work. "What is it?" Katherine took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. In late summer, I think." Preston's eyes widened, a look of wonder spreading across his face. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby," Katherine nodded, her heart full at his obvious joy. "Our baby." Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "Katherine," he breathed against her hair. "I didn't think I could be any happier than I already was, but you keep proving me wrong." They sat together by the fire, talking softly of the future, how Thomas would react to having a younger sibling, whether the baby would be a boy or girl, what changes they might need to make to accommodate a growing family. The house might be getting crowded soon, Preston mused, his hand resting protectively over Katherine's middle. Might need to think about expanding again. Katherine laughed. "Let's wait until this little one arrives before you start building again," she suggested. "But yes, eventually we might need more space." Preston's expression grew more serious. "There's something else we should discuss, Katherine, something I've been putting off." "What is it?" she asked, concerned by his sudden gravity. "Henry," Preston said simply. "He's still out there. Still legally your husband, at least in his mind." Katherine tensed at the mention of Henry's name. In the happiness of recent months, she had managed to push thoughts of him to the back of her mind. "Do you think he'll come looking for us again?" "I don't know," Preston admitted. "But with a new baby coming, I think we need to resolve this once and for all. Make sure he has no legal claim on you or Thomas or this new little one." Katherine nodded slowly. "You're right. But how? You said yourself the law usually favors husbands." "I've been corresponding with Judge Parker," Preston explained. "He suggests filing for divorce on grounds of cruelty, using your testimony and the visible evidence of your injuries that I witnessed when you first arrived here." He paused, his expression pained at the memory. "It won't be easy and Henry might contest it, but the judge thinks we have a good case." Katherine considered his words, one hand unconsciously rising to touch her cheek where Henry's blows had once left bruises. "Will I have to see him? To testify in person?" Preston shook his head. "Not if we can help it. Judge Parker has suggested a deposition. You would write your testimony, swear to its truth before a notary, and the judge would consider it along with my statement and any evidence Henry presents. And if the divorce is granted, what then?" "Then we would legally marry," Preston said simply. "Make official what we already know in our hearts to be true." He squeezed her hand. "I know we've had our ceremony, exchanged our vows before God, but this would protect you and the children under the law." Katherine took a deep breath, gathering her courage. For too long she had been running from Henry from the past. Perhaps it was time to face it head-on, to claim the future she wanted rather than hiding from the one she feared. "All right," she said finally. "Let's do it. Let's file for divorce." Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll write to the judge tomorrow. We'll get through this together, Katherine. I promise." As winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, giving way to the tentative green of early spring, the legal process Preston had initiated began to move forward. Judge Parker sent formal papers for Katherine to complete, detailing the abuse she had suffered at Henry's hands. Writing it all down was painful, forcing her to relive moments she had tried to forget, but Preston's unwavering support gave her the strength to continue. By April, when the first wildflowers began to dot the meadows surrounding the ranch, word came from Judge Parker that Henry had been officially notified of the divorce proceedings. His response, the judge warned, had been one of cold fury. He denied all allegations of cruelty, and insisted that Katherine had abandoned their marriage without cause, taking his son illegally. "He's demanding custody of Thomas," Katherine said, her voice shaking as she read the judge's letter. "Says I'm an unfit mother." Preston's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "He won't get custody. The judge has your testimony and mine. And Henry's reputation isn't as spotless as he might think. Apparently there have been whispers about his temper for years, but no one dared speak against the town banker." Katherine wasn't entirely reassured. "But what if—" "No what ifs," Preston interrupted gently, taking her hands in his. "We're going to face this together, one step at a time. Right now, you need to focus on staying healthy for our baby. Let me worry about Henry Blackwell." Though she tried to follow Preston's advice, Katherine couldn't help feeling anxious as they waited for Judge Parker's decision. Her pregnancy progressed, her belly rounding visibly by May, and Thomas celebrated his first birthday with a small celebration that included Miguel and his family. Life at the ranch continued its peaceful routine, but the uncertainty of the legal situation cast a shadow over their happiness. In early June, as Katherine was planting the last of the summer vegetables in the garden, Thomas playing nearby on a blanket, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw Preston riding toward the cabin alongside another rider she didn't recognize. Instinctively, Katherine gathered Thomas into her arms, her heart racing until she saw Preston's relaxed posture and easy smile. Whoever this visitor was, Preston clearly didn't view them as a threat. As they drew closer, Katherine could see that the stranger was an older man, distinguished-looking with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He rode with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to respect. "Katherine," Preston called as they dismounted, "this is Judge Parker. He's brought news he wanted to deliver in person." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. Judge Parker's presence could mean only one thing: a decision had been reached in her divorce case. "Mrs. Whitaker," the judge said, approaching with a respectful nod. "Or perhaps I should still say Mrs. Blackwell, until matters are formalized." "Katherine, please," she managed, shifting Thomas on her hip. "It's an honor to meet you, Judge Parker." The judge smiled kindly. "The honor is mine. Your husband, Mr. Whitaker, has spoken highly of you in his letters." He glanced at her visibly pregnant state, his expression softening further. "Perhaps we should go inside. I have matters to discuss that would be better addressed sitting down." Preston led them into the cabin, where Katherine quickly prepared coffee while trying to calm her racing thoughts. When they were all seated at the table, Thomas contentedly playing with wooden blocks on the floor nearby, Judge Parker removed several official-looking documents from his saddlebag. "I wanted to deliver these personally," he explained, "given the delicate nature of the situation." He placed the papers on the table, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Blackwell, after reviewing all testimony and evidence in your petition for divorce, I have made my decision." Katherine held her breath, her hand seeking Preston's under the table. "The divorce is granted," Judge Parker said simply, "on grounds of extreme cruelty and abandonment." Relief flooded through Katherine, so intense that for a moment she couldn't speak. Preston's hand tightened around hers, his own relief evident in the slight tremor of his fingers. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Judge." The judge nodded, but his expression remained grave. "There is more you should know," he continued. "Mr. Blackwell did not accept this decision graciously. He made threats concerning both of you and the child." Preston straightened, his expression hardening. "What kind of threats?" "Vague ones primarily," Judge Parker replied, "but concerning enough that I felt you should be warned. Mr. Blackwell is a man accustomed to power and privilege. Being denied what he considers his right may provoke him to reckless action." Catherine's arms instinctively went around her swollen middle, fear replacing the momentary relief. "You think he might come here, try to take Thomas," Judge Parker sighed. "I think it's a possibility you should be prepared for, yes. However," he added, removing another document from his bag, "I've taken the liberty of issuing a formal order of protection. It legally prevents Henry Blackwell from approaching within 100 yards of you, your son, or this property." He slid the paper across the table. "It's not a perfect solution, but it provides legal recourse should he violate it." Preston examined the document, his expression grim but satisfied. "This helps, Judge, thank you." "There is one more matter to address," Judge Parker said, producing a final set of papers. "Given your current situation," he glanced meaningfully at Catherine's pregnant state, "I thought you might wish to formalize your marriage immediately. I've brought the necessary documents, and as a judge, I am authorized to perform the ceremony officially." Catherine looked at Preston, whose face broke into a wide smile. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, we would like that very much." The ceremony that followed was brief but meaningful. With Thomas watching curiously and Miguel, who had been called in from the fields, standing as witness, Catherine and Preston once again exchanged vows, this time with the full legal weight of the territory behind them. When Judge Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Catherine tenderly, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their child grew. "No one will ever separate us," he whispered against her lips. "I promise you that, Katherine Whitaker." After sharing a meal with them, Judge Parker prepared to leave, promising to file all the paperwork immediately upon his return to town. As Preston walked him to his horse, the judge spoke quietly. "Your wife has been through a terrible ordeal, Mr. Whitaker. She's fortunate to have found a good man." Preston nodded, his eyes on Catherine as she stood on the porch with Thomas. "I'm the fortunate one, Judge. She's the strongest person I've ever known." Judge Parker followed his gaze, a small smile touching his lips. "Keep an eye out all the same. Men like Henry Blackwell don't take defeat easily." "I'll be ready," Preston assured him, his voice hardening slightly. "No one will harm my family while I draw breath." As Judge Parker rode away, Preston returned to the porch, gathering Catherine and Thomas into his arms. "It's over," he said softly. "You're free, Catherine, legally and truly free." Catherine leaned into his embrace, feeling truly secure for the first time since fleeing Silver Creek. "We're free," she corrected gently. "All of us together." That night, as they lay in bed, Catherine nestled against Preston's side, his hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. She allowed herself to fully believe in their future. The divorce was granted, their marriage was legal, and soon their family would grow with the addition of a new baby. Despite Judge Parker's warning about Henry, Catherine refused to let fear shadow this moment of happiness. "What shall we name the baby?" Preston asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her stomach. Catherine smiled in the darkness. "If it's a boy, I thought perhaps James, after your father." "James," Preston repeated, sounding pleased. "And if it's a girl," Catherine considered for a moment. "Elizabeth. It was my grandmother's name, the one who taught me about preserving food and gardening." "James or Elizabeth Whitaker," Preston murmured. "Perfect names for our child." As Catherine drifted toward sleep, she felt the baby move within her, a gentle reminder of the new life they had created together. Whatever challenges might lie ahead, they would face them as a family, bound by love stronger than any legal document could express. The summer of 1876 brought abundant growth to the Whitaker ranch. The cattle thrived in the lush pastures, the garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and Catherine's belly grew rounder with each passing week. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler of 15 months, wobbled confidently around the cabin and yard, his curiosity boundless and his vocabulary expanding daily. Preston had hired additional help for the summer, 2 young cowboys, eager for work allowing him to spend more time close to home as Catherine's due date approached. He expanded the garden, built a small playground area for Thomas complete with a swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree, and began work on a cradle for the new baby, carving it from the same pine he had used for Thomas's crib. "This one will have wildflowers," he explained as he showed Catherine his design, "since he or she will be our summer baby." Catherine traced the pattern with her finger, touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's beautiful, Preston, just like everything you make." Life had settled into a sweet rhythm, their legal troubles seemingly behind them. There had been no word of Henry since Judge Parker's visit, and as the weeks passed, Catherine allowed herself to believe that perhaps he had accepted the divorce and moved on with his life. July brought intense heat to the valley, making Catherine's final weeks of pregnancy particularly uncomfortable. She found relief in the creek that ran through their property, often sitting with her feet in the cool water while Thomas played nearby under Preston's watchful eye. "Not much longer now," Preston said one afternoon, noting how Catherine rubbed her lower back. "Doc Wilson said mid-July, didn't he?" Catherine nodded, shifting to find a more comfortable position. "Any day now, I think. This baby feels ready to meet the world." Preston smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I can't wait to meet him, or her." "Neither can I," Catherine admitted, "though I'll be glad to be able to see my feet again." Preston laughed, helping her up from her seat by the creek. "Come on, it's getting hot out here. Let's get you and Thomas back to the shade." As they walked slowly back toward the cabin, Catherine felt a sudden sharp pain low in her abdomen. She stopped, clutching Preston's arm as she waited for it to pass. "Catherine," Preston's voice was instantly concerned. "Just a pain," she assured him, though something told her this was more than the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. "It's passing now." They continued to the cabin, but before they reached the porch, another pain gripped her, this one stronger than the first. Catherine gasped, instinctively pressing a hand to her belly. "Preston," she said, looking up at his worried face, "I think it's time." The next hours passed in a blur of increasing pain and focused determination. Preston sent one of the young cowboys to fetch the midwife from a neighboring ranch, while Miguel took Thomas to stay with his family, keeping the boy well away from the confusion and worry. By the time Senora Hernandez, the experienced midwife, arrived, Catherine's labor was well established. The older woman shooed Preston from the bedroom with firm instructions to boil water and prepare clean linens, giving Catherine a reassuring smile as she examined her. "The baby is in good position," she announced in her accented English. "Everything progresses normally. You are strong, Senora." "This will go well." Catherine nodded, grateful for the woman's confidence even as another contraction seized her. The pain was familiar from Thomas's birth, but no less intense for its familiarity. Hours passed, the summer day fading into evening as Catherine labored. Preston was a constant presence, wiping her brow with cool cloths, supporting her back when she needed to change positions, murmuring encouragement when the pain seemed unbearable. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as midnight approached, and her strength began to flag. "You can do this, Catherine. Just a little longer." Finally, as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, the midwife announced that it was time to push. Catherine gathered her remaining strength, Preston supporting her as she bore down with each contraction, determined to bring their child into the world. With a final, tremendous effort, Catherine felt the baby slip free, the intense pressure suddenly released. A moment of silence was followed by a healthy cry, strong, indignant, and wonderfully alive. "A girl," Senora Hernandez announced triumphantly, quickly cleaning and wrapping the newborn. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Preston's face, when Katherine could focus on it through her exhaustion, was transformed with wonder and joy. "A daughter," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a daughter, Katherine." The midwife placed the tiny bundle in Katherine's arms, and she looked down into a tiny, red face crowned with dark hair, so different from Thomas's fair coloring. The baby's eyes, when they briefly opened, were a deep blue that Katherine suspected might eventually darken to match Preston's. "Elizabeth," Katherine murmured, tracing one finger along the baby's soft cheek. "Elizabeth Whitaker." Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Katherine's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his daughter's head. "She's perfect," he said softly, "just like her mother." The midwife efficiently completed her work, ensuring both mother and child were clean and comfortable, before discreetly leaving the new parents alone with their daughter. Katherine, exhausted but euphoric, leaned against Preston's solid presence as they marveled at the tiny life they had created. "Thomas will be excited to meet his sister," Preston said, carefully cradling Elizabeth when Katherine's arms grew tired. Katherine agreed, her eyelids growing heavy. "He'll be a wonderful big brother." Preston pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Rest now, my love. You've done the hardest work imaginable today. I'll watch over Elizabeth." Katherine didn't need to be told twice. Safe in the knowledge that her husband and newborn daughter were both well, she allowed herself to drift into much-needed sleep. Later that day, when the sun was high in the summer sky, Miguel brought Thomas to meet his new sister. The toddler approached the cradle cautiously, peering at the small bundle with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Baby," he said, pointing at Elizabeth. "Yes, Thomas," Katherine confirmed from her place in the bed. "This is your sister, Elizabeth." Thomas considered this information seriously. "My baby," Preston chuckled, ruffling the boy's fair hair. "That's right, son, your sister. You're a big brother now." Thomas seemed satisfied with this explanation. He peered at Elizabeth once more, then turned his attention to more pressing matters, namely, climbing onto the bed to cuddle with his mother, whom he had missed during their separation. As Katherine held Thomas close, with Preston sitting beside them cradling Elizabeth, she was overwhelmed by a sense of completion. This was her family, built not from obligation or social expectation, but from love freely given and received. From the desperate flight from Silver Creek to this moment of perfect contentment, the journey had been difficult, but the destination was worth every painful step. The remainder of the summer passed in a haze of sleepless nights and busy days as the family adjusted to their newest member. Elizabeth proved to be a good-natured baby, crying only when hungry or uncomfortable, and smiling early, a gummy, heart-melting expression that instantly wrapped everyone around her tiny finger. Thomas quickly adapted to his role as big brother, bringing his toys to show Lizzie, his own version of Elizabeth, and patting her gently when she cried. Katherine often found Preston watching the two children together, his expression soft with love and pride. "What are you thinking?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, Elizabeth asleep in her arms while Thomas played with wooden blocks at their feet. Preston smiled, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he said simply. "That I have everything I ever wanted right here on this porch." Katherine leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her. "So do I," she murmured, "though I never knew this was what I wanted until I found it." The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. Preston tensed slightly, a habit developed during the uncertain months of their legal battle, but relaxed when he recognized the rider as one of their neighbors. "John," he called in greeting as the man dismounted. "What brings you out this way?" John Parker, who ranched several miles to the east, removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Evening, Preston, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, nodding respectfully to Katherine. "Just passing along some news I thought you should know." Something in his tone made Katherine sit up straighter, instinctively holding Elizabeth closer. "What news?" Preston asked, his voice carefully neutral. John glanced at Katherine, seemingly hesitant to speak in front of her. Preston noticed the look and frowned slightly. "Whatever it is, John, Katherine should hear it too," the neighbor nodded, replacing his hat nervously. "It's about Henry Blackwell," he said finally. "Word came from Silver Creek that he's dead." Katherine gasped softly, shock washing over her. "Dead," she repeated. "How?" "Shot in a dispute at the bank," John explained, his eyes sympathetic. "Apparently he'd been drinking heavily these past months, grew increasingly erratic, threatened the wrong man and paid the price." He paused, then added quietly, "Thought you should know given the history." Preston's hand found Katherine's, squeezing gently. "Thank you for telling us, John," he said, his voice even. "Can we offer you some coffee before you head back?" John shook his head. "Need to get home before dark. Just wanted to make sure you heard from a friend rather than through gossip." He tipped his hat. "Congratulations on your daughter, by the way. She's a beauty." After John had ridden away, Preston and Katherine sat in silence, both processing the unexpected news. Thomas continued playing contentedly, unaware of the significance of what they had just learned. "How do you feel?" Preston finally asked, his eyes searching Katherine's face with concern. Katherine considered the question carefully. There was no grief. She realized no sense of loss for the man who had brought her so much pain. Yet neither was there the vindictive satisfaction she might have expected. Instead, she felt a curious sense of closure, as if a door had firmly shut on a chapter of her life that had remained partially open despite the divorce. "Relieved," she said at last. "Relieved that we don't have to worry about him finding us or trying to take Thomas. And—" She hesitated, sad in a way, not for Henry himself but for the waste of a life, for what might have been if he had been a different kind of man. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You have a generous heart, Katherine Whitaker." She smiled faintly, looking down at Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her arms, then at Thomas playing at their feet. "Not generous," she corrected gently. "Just grateful. Henry's choices led him to a lonely, bitter end. Mine led me here to you, to our children, to this life we're building. I can't help but feel blessed by the comparison." Preston leaned over to kiss her softly. "We are blessed," he agreed, "and now we can look forward without any shadows from the past." As the sun set over the Montana Valley, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the Whitaker family remained on their porch, embracing the present and dreaming of the future, a future now free from the last lingering fear that had haunted their happiness. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Whitaker ranch. The original cabin, with its carefully planned addition, eventually gave way to a proper 2-story farmhouse as the family and the ranch prospered. Preston's careful management and hard work had expanded their holdings to include additional grazing land and a small apple orchard that Katherine had insisted would thrive despite the harsh Montana winters. Thomas, now 6, had grown into a sturdy, thoughtful boy with his mother's kind nature and a love of animals that suggested he would follow in Preston's footsteps as a rancher. Elizabeth, 5 and fiercely independent, had her father's blue eyes and determination, following her brother everywhere and insisting on helping with grown-up chores despite her small size. The most unexpected change had come 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, when Katherine had given birth to twins James and Sarah, doubling the size of their family in one eventful night. The twins, now 3, were a study in contrasts. James quiet and observant, Sarah chattering from the moment she could form words. On a warm September afternoon in 1881, Katherine stood on the wide porch of their home, watching Preston teaching Thomas to ride his own pony, a recent birthday gift that had the boy nearly bursting with pride. Elizabeth sat on the bottom step, carefully braiding wildflowers into a crown for her doll, while the twins napped inside under the watchful eye of Miguel's daughter, Maria, who helped with the children several days a week. As Katherine observed her family, a wave of contentment washed over her. From the desperate young woman who had fled Silver Creek with nothing but her infant son and the clothes on her back, to this mistress of a thriving ranch, mother of 4 beautiful children, wife to a man whose love had never wavered. Preston must have felt her gaze, for he looked up from his lesson with Thomas, smiling as he caught her eye. With a few words to the boy, who continued practicing his riding with focused determination, Preston crossed the yard to join Katherine on the porch. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Whitaker," he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Katherine leaned into his embrace, smiling up at him. Despite the years of ranch work and Montana weather, Preston remained as handsome as the day she'd first met him, perhaps more so, with the added confidence of a man who knew his place in the world and was content with it. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she admitted. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't found Thomas and me that day by the creek." Preston's eyes softened at the memory. "Best day of my life," he said simply, though I didn't know it at the time. "You saved us," Katherine said softly. Preston shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Katherine, you saved yourself when you found the courage to leave Silver Creek. I just provided a safe place to land." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Everything we have now we built together." Katherine couldn't argue with that assessment. They had indeed built this life together through seasons of plenty and occasional hardship, through childbirth and illness, through all the challenges that came with carving out a life in this beautiful but demanding land. "Mama, Papa, look," Elizabeth called, proudly holding up her completed flower crown. "Isn't it pretty? Beautiful, Princess," Preston called back, his face lighting with the special smile he reserved for his firstborn daughter. "Almost as beautiful as you." Elizabeth beamed, carefully placing the crown on her doll's head before skipping off to find new flowers. "She has you wrapped around her little finger," Katherine observed, amused. Preston chuckled, not bothering to deny it. "All of them do, you too, for that matter." "Speaking of the children," Katherine said, her voice casual though her heart quickened slightly, "we might need to start thinking about another bedroom soon." Preston looked puzzled for a moment, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Katherine, are you saying?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face at his expression of delighted shock. "Yes, sometime next spring if my calculations are correct." With a whoop of joy that startled Thomas on his pony, Preston swept Katherine into his arms, spinning her around before setting her gently back on her feet. "Another baby," he said wonderingly, one hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "I thought we were finished after the twins nearly wore you out." "So did I," Katherine admitted with a laugh, "but it seems God had other plans." Preston pulled her close, his expression suddenly serious despite the joy still evident in his eyes. "Are you happy about it, truly?" "Because 4 children are already a handful, and with the ranch." Katherine silenced him with a kiss. "I'm happy," she assured him when they parted. Surprised but happy. This is the life I choose, Preston. You, our children, this ranch. Every day I choose it again, and I've never regretted that choice once. The worry lines eased from Preston's face. Nor have I, he said softly. Not once in all these years. From the corral, Thomas called for his father's attention, eager to show off a new skill. Preston pressed one more quick kiss to Catherine's lips before jogging back to resume the riding lesson. Katherine watched him go, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had become so much more than just her rescuer. As the afternoon sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Katherine took a moment to absorb the scene before her son learning to ride under his father's patient guidance, her daughter creating beauty from wildflowers, her twins sleeping peacefully inside the home Preston had built for them, and a new life growing within her, another branch on the family tree they had planted together. 6 years ago, she had fled town with nothing but her baby, desperate and afraid. Today, she stood on the porch of a home built with love, surrounded by the family that had blossomed from that desperate beginning. "Thank you," Katherine whispered, the words carried away by the gentle Montana breeze. Gratitude for the journey, for the second chances, for the love that had transformed a simple shelter into a home. In the corral, Preston looked up as if he had heard her, his smile warm and sure across the distance between them. It was the smile of a man who had found everything he ever wanted, not in gold or glory or fortune, but in the quiet miracle of family, of love given and received, of a home built not just with wood and nails, but with patience and kindness and unwavering commitment. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, Katherine Whitaker stepped off the porch to join her family, carrying with her the precious knowledge that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single desperate step into the unknown and end in the place where your heart finally finds its home.